Hello, welcome to the Mistwood Publishing Book Club. I am your host, S.R. Mowry, and today we'll be looking at The Veil of Stars, Chapter 4, Leaving Home. So first and foremost, I do want to just go ahead and remind you guys that the book is available on the website, but also I'd just like to take a moment and thank everybody that's watching these videos and following along, reading the book. Anybody who's read the book before, anybody who's watching the videos, I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. You have no idea how much it means, how much work I put into all of this. And I think very often, in the modern day, we don't often express compliments or gratitude, especially I think maybe males deal with it more frequently. And so I really do appreciate, the words that you say, and the kind things that you share, and just that I can see that people are viewing it, and I really do appreciate that. Again, I put a lot of work into this, and it feels good to know that, at least some people are really enjoying it. So, thank you. So Chapter 4, Leaving Home, is, I feel like it's not a very long chapter, but I think I read it in like 15 minutes, but that might be just because I know what happens. And so this chapter is split into two pieces, which is, now that we've introduced Talia, we are following the two main protagonists, which is Narbad and Talia. Now, Narbad's part of the chapter is kind of Hayal and Narbad bringing the situation up to the other orcs in the town, in the city, the slaves. And understandably so, it starts out with the other orcs not, they're like kind of hesitant to trust, this offer. They're hesitant to put their lives on the line for something like this because it's been proven so many times that, maybe humans aren't to be trusted. But through Narbad's bravery, and being the first one to sign the document, putting his own life on the line for this, it kind of, orcs respect that sort of thing. They're very, in my books, they're very honor-based, very, maybe how we kind of view Marines, and that they, at the end of the day, they're going to do what they have to do, and they're not going to, they're going to get it done, and that they're going to follow through on what they say. At least for me, that's how I kind of view Marines and Navy SEALs. There's a certain amount of respect there because I know that they're going to put the money where their mouth is, and that they mean business when they say something. And that's kind of what the orcs in this book, they kind of respect that, and they kind of have this mutual trust with each other, that I would imagine that Marines would have with each other. And so when Narbad goes up and signs the document, it's kind of showing, I'm putting my money where my mouth is. I say this is a good cause, and I'm going to risk my life for it, for the idea that we could be free. And that speaks volumes to the other orcs. And so at the end of that section, you have essentially the orc army that will be, fighting for their freedom is raised. And so that's kind of the point of that section. Now the other section is essentially Talia meeting the other characters that are going to be, the main characters, the companions, if you will, of the entire book. And I would have loved to have included all of these characters on the front cover, but it would have taken up way too much room. And it would have probably felt a little overcrowded. So that's why I kind of just went with the three main, Ruth, Narbad, Talia on the front there. However, I do have various pictures from the visual companion, which I will bring out, and I'll probably attach photos of the characters up here just so that you guys can have that experience of seeing what they look like, right? So the first two characters that we're introduced to, other than, Talia and Ruth in this section of the chapter, and Grohl, is, and I do actually have Grohl illustrated on the Sylvan Mist cover, so I'll put that over here. Actually, I have an old copy, one of the first versions of it with a primer company I didn't go with. There's Grohl. A little bit later in his existence, but he doesn't age, so he looks the same. But I'll probably put the picture on here anyway, just so you can get a really good look of him. But the first one we get, other than those three, is Boflin and Ragni. And these are my two dwarf characters. I love dwarves. Dwarves are my favorite Lord of the Rings race. I just love them. They are amazing. And in my books, I kind of take it to kind of a natural level of how I see the dwarves, and that is that they don't like change. They are greedy, but they don't like change. They don't trust outsiders. They're very reclusive, but they're very honorable, and they love killing bad guys, basically. Obviously, a large portion of the dwarf archetype comes from Gimli in Lord of the Rings. And most dwarves in fantasy do kind of fit his, his personality pretty on point. But I kind of already have that covered in the Sylvan Mist. Later in the series, Elion, the main character, later in the series has a best friend that's a dwarf named Terran Ironback, and he kind of fits already that typical dwarf stereotype of like Gimli, which is an excellent stereotype, which is why I love writing it, and which is why probably the most famous dwarf in my books, Terran, will, he is different than Gimli, obviously, but he has, he's definitely that dwarf, that fantasy dwarf character. Boflin and Ragni I wanted to make a little bit different than the stereotypical dwarf character. So Boflin definitely embodies that more than Ragni, but Boflin is like pure hothead, pure quick to anger. He's very aggressive. He's very confrontational. And so he's almost like, he is more like Gimli than Ragni is, but he's so much more angry than Gimli, and he's so much more intense and forward with what he thinks. And so we get quite a bit of an introduction between Boflin and Ruth kind of having an argument, and you can kind of tell that the dwarves are a bit more of a conservative group of people. They don't like change. Although I don't mean like a modern American conservative. I mean like conservative means that you want to stay with what was. You don't want change necessarily. You don't want to fix what you don't think is broken. And dwarves are very much so that they like consistency. They like to keep things the way they are if they're working well. And they kind of see elves as the antithesis of that. In a lot of ways, elves are. So although there's not like an allegorical comparison between the two political entities in America, because they don't exist in this book, obviously, I did draw upon some of the typical arguments that maybe Republicans and Democrats have, and kind of how they view each other. How Republicans see Democrats, how Democrats see Republicans. I drew upon some of that for this conversation, but not a lot, and it's definitely not meant to be anything allegorical. But it is like a fantasy trope that dwarves and elves don't always get along, and that's because they are so different. So to me, it seemed natural that, you know, dwarves who have a tendency in fantasy to be the more rugged, dirty, blue-collar worker kind of no nonsense on social stuff. It made sense to me to make them more of the conservative side, and the elves, which are typically very artistic and not necessarily stereotypically masculine. It made sense to make them to kind of draw upon, I don't have to explain it, but in America there is that tension between the two of one side sees the other as more effeminate, less masculine, and the other sees the other as dirty and uneducated and things like that. So although it's not meant to be allegorical of anything political in our life, in our world, I did draw upon some of those connections because I felt like they would also apply here. So Baughlan, accuses Ruth of basically, manipulating the truth and lying and pretending it's not lying, and you lie so much that you don't even know you're lying anymore. And Ruth calls Baughlan uneducated and dirty and stupid and things like that. And so to me, I thought I could draw from those very real conversations that I've had in life and kind of apply it to that classic fantasy relationship between dwarf and elf. Now, Ragni is kind of like a goofball dwarf. He's very much so not the stereotypical dwarf fantasy character. He does seem pretty uneducated because he doesn't talk very educated. And he makes like sounds, and he's like, woo! And he's just kind of a goofy dwarf character. And I have to give credit where credit is due. I was reading an R.A. Salvatore book when I first read a dwarf that was goofy, and I was like, well, I didn't know that they could be like that. And so this is kind of my take on, a more goofy dwarf that's lovable in a kind of an innocent way. He kind of keeps his brother Baughlan in check, and I think they have a good dynamic together. The next characters we meet are, I think the next one is Tima. Tima is a character that, I'll be honest, she didn't have a lot of development until pretty late in the process, and then I was like, oh my goodness, I totally didn't give her much development, and so I went back and kind of fixed her character. And I did that before I published the book. I went through and made sure that each character had something where they grew, where there was something where people could connect with them and maybe relate to them, even minor characters. Because Tima does not say too much in the story. She's kind of the quiet, epic, cool female elf character, kind of like a female Legolas but without a bow. And she, right away, Talia kind of picks up on some sexual tension between Tima and Ruth, and that they have a history together that will be revealed later on. Next we meet Linod Greyleaf, and he is my cleric character. And I'm gonna hype him up a little bit here, guys. Linod is very rigid and kind of like by the book, but he kind of, he grows. But here's the thing, though. One of my biggest pet peeves in fantasy is everyone's always like, oh, well, the wizards are so powerful. Oh no, a wizard's coming, a wizard's on the battlefield, how are we going to defeat them? And then they fight them and nothing happens. Nothing impressive happens. So I wanted to make my magic users actually seem like a formidable force to be dealt with. So whenever you see Lenod actually engage in combat, just be ready because I go all out with my magic users. Like, to me, magic should be like just something we've never seen before. It's just like beyond our realm of thought because it is, you know, not real in our world. And so I go all out, and in my books, when there's a wizard on the field or a cleric, because magic works a little bit differently in my world, it's a force to be reckoned with, and it is a very real threat where a lot of people are going to die because unlike in D&D, if somebody puts the time into magic, they're going to be a force to be reckoned with. So I'll just say, yeah, Lenod definitely tends to be some people's favorite character because he's just awesome. He's an epic, religious warrior, a true religious knight, champion for God with magical powers. And I mean, who doesn't love that? Next we meet Rillaline, and he is, I don't want to say too much about him because I don't want to spoil stuff, but he is a scarlet-haired elf, so he's a wood elf, and he graduated top of his class at Mog Durrig, which is an impressive feat, and he is introduced with Nelid Selethor. Now, any of you who have read The Silver Mist might recognize the last name Selethor. And that's because later on in my book series, the name Selethor is going to carry quite a bit of weight. And for those of you who have read The Sylvan Mist, Nelid is said character's uncle. For those of you who haven't read The Sylvan Mist, I still would encourage you, I mean, you can read it, but I would almost suggest to wait on it, because I'm going to re-edit it and re-release it, remastered with new chapters, new cover, and The Silver Mist does contain a few spoilers for what happens in the future installments of the Narbad trilogy. I wrote Saga 5 first, and then I went back and did Saga 1. I know that's not ideal, but I knew I wasn't ready to write this book, so I wrote one that was easier to write, and it ended up paying off because this book wouldn't be as good as it is if I had done this one first. So anyway, if you haven't read Saga 5, The Silver Mist, don't feel like you need to, but I mean, obviously you can. It does have spoilers for, who's left at the end of Narbad's trilogy. So, anyway. There's one pretty big spoiler in particular, but yeah. So Nelid, Selethor, and Rillaline. Nelid's a half-elf, which Ruth does display his disdain. If you're picking up on a lot of racism with elves within their own species even, that's very intentional. Half-elves are kind of considered not really elves by most elves, and since Ruth is a high elf, he's considered to be like the most pure. High elves and water elves are considered to be the most pure of the elves. Wood elves are still pure elf, but they're still a step lower. So Rillaline and Nelid are kind of considered inferior in Ruth's eyes because they're not a high elf. That doesn't mean he doesn't like them. He likes them more than a dwarf, but he would see them as less than. Which is something that makes Ruth more of a complicated character because he is pretty racist. But, and there's no justification for that, but he is not a static character, and kind of seeing his journey, he has a very good arc in this book. Very good arc. Very proud of it. I've been told some people that's his favorite character because of the journey that he has. So that's all the characters. I don't want to go too deep into their personalities because I would have to spoil things. But I like the last line where Elaine says, "And so begins a grand adventure." Elaine cheered, a wide grin on his handsome face. I think that's a good way to end a chapter. We have Lennon Grayleaf. This is the visual companion part for him. This is the visual companion pages for Elaine and Nelid. We have Ragni and Bothlin. And then we have Tina. That's all for this week. Next week we'll be looking at the next chapter, chapter 5. And that is one of my favorite chapters. Really, the rest of the chapters for part 1 are some of my absolute favorites because of the sheer amount of character development that happens for Narbad and Talia is pretty immense and cannot be understated. Have a lovely week, guys. I will see you next week. Although I'm going to film next week's video now because next weekend is my birthday weekend, and so I'll be doing other things. But I still want a video to release for you guys. Have a great week. Peace out.